Thank you, Mr. President. Now I rise to speak about the Gina McCarthy nomination to head the EPA, and in particular, efforts that I've led with my Republican colleagues on the Environment and Public Works Committee to bring a whole lot more sunshine and transparency to EPA, something that's been sorely lacking for a long time and has been a particular problem, really reached new depths in terms of a problem in the last 4 years. Now, Mr. President, when this important nomination first came up, I focused specifically on these important transparency, openness issues. Now, I disagree with the Obama administration EPA on all sorts of substantive issues, including, for instance, to take the most obvious, their war on coal. I disagree with both the past administrator and this nominee, Gina McCarthy, on all of those key substantive issues like this war on coal. But I specifically chose not to focus on that in the nomination. I knew President Obama won the election. I knew he had a fundamentally different view than I do on those key environmental and economic issues. What I focused on with other Republican members of our committee was something that should be beyond dispute, beyond partisanship, really beyond debate, the need for openness and transparency with regard to what EPA does and why they do it. This has been a battle I've been waging for a long time, including on the EPW committee. And Mr. President, I think this is a crucial issue. For a long time, EPA, under multiple administrations, has lost the confidence of Congress and the American people. It used to be, including when EPA was first founded in the first decade of its existence, that it was viewed as a non-ideological group of experts. It was viewed as being led by real scientists and real science, peer-reviewed expert science, not by ideology, not by political agendas, not by partisanship. Unfortunately, Mr. President, I think EPA and a lot of federal agencies, but EPA is perhaps the worst example, has gotten far afield from that. And it is viewed by most Americans, myself included, as led by ideology, motivated by partisanship and a political agenda, not sober, sound science. And that's why we need to get back to complete openness and transparency so that we see what EPA is doing, why they're doing it, and try to hold them accountable so that their decisions are based on objective science, not cherry-picking science, not partisan science, not what I would call New York Times or tabloid science. And again, those are what all of my key requests of EPA and the nominee over this Gina McCarthy nomination went to. Over many weeks, in fact months, Mr. President, I went back and forth with Ms. McCarthy and EPA over these very basic, sound, reasonable requests. And the good news is, although it took a lot of back and forth, the good news is in each of the 5 key categories I identified on behalf of all of the Republican members of EPW, we were able to secure real, meaningful, and substantial commitments in terms of moving the ball forward in at least 4 of those categories, and we're going to move the ball across the goal line in the 5th category as well. So let me briefly outline those 5 important categories that all relate to openness and transparency and where we're getting with regard to our agreements with the EPA over the last several weeks. Request number 1 had to do with FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. Now, as anybody who's followed it in the news, EPA has really drug its feet and frustrated a lot of legitimate FOIA requests by private citizens, by states affected, by other stakeholders. The Freedom of Information Act was designed to put sunshine on the federal government, to allow everyday citizens, anyone, the ability to get basic, important information from any federal agency. And yet, as news releases and certain incidents illustrate over the last several years, EPA has really tried to frustrate that process. In fact, in certain documents we were able to obtain, we even got an email from within the General Counsel's office at EPA instructing all of the satellite offices of EPA around the country how to frustrate legitimate FOIA requests, how to delay, how to frustrate, how to obfuscate. It wasn't about a particular FOIA request that they may have thought was out of bounds or inappropriate. It was just about how to frustrate in general. That is completely inappropriate. That's beyond the bounds of the law. So we talked in great detail to EPA about how they have to change that. And this basically summarizes the agreements we reached. First, EPA agreed to mandate the retraining of all of their workforce, 17,000 plus people, to tell them not how to frustrate FOIA requests, but what FOIA is about, how to live by the law, how to honor FOIA requests in an open and timely way. Secondly, EPA committed to issuing new guidance on records maintenance and the use of personal email accounts. One way a lot of folks at EPA clearly were frustrating FOIA requests is they would do official business on personal email accounts. And so when a FOIA request was made, their EPA emails were produced, but lo and behold, the really important stuff, the stuff they wanted to hide, was on their personal accounts. And that is clearly a pattern that's been used at EPA and other federal agencies to frustrate openness and transparency and FOIA. So EPA is specifically going to issue new guidance to say that is absolutely illegal, that is absolutely off limits. And most importantly, trust but verify, and here's the verify, the independent EPA Inspector General will complete an audit about all of this stuff. So we're going to put an end to FOIA abuse, and we're going to make sure every American has FOIA as a legitimate tool for information, for openness and transparency, as was intended when Congress passed that law. The second category that I focused on in my discussions with EPA were emails and communications, exactly what I was talking about before. There's been a pattern, and several high-ranking officials were involved, including Lisa Jackson, the former administrator. There's been a pattern of using personal email accounts, also fake email names, to, in my opinion, hide important information from the public. And the clearest example is what I said a minute ago. If you do the really important business on your personal account and somebody sends in a FOIA request and then the agency produces your official emails, guess what? The really important stuff isn't produced. It's hidden. And that has to stop. And so we demanded a lot of things in this category. First of all, the nominee herself, we asked her to review her personal email accounts and report back that she hadn't used it for agency-related matters. She did that. She confirmed that. Secondly, EPW continues to coordinate with the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee to obtain further information. We do not have, and let me be crystal clear about this, Republicans on the EPW committee have not obtained everything we've asked for or everything we deserve with regard to emails and communications. So we're working with the House committee with subpoena power, and we're working closely with them, and we're gonna get, even if it takes using their subpoena power, what we deserve. And then both committees recently put the EPA on notice that they are considering issuing subpoenas with regard to just that. So this is the category where we have gotten the least from the EPA with regard to our discussions regarding the Gina McCarthy nomination. But I just want to make very clear so no one is surprised. We're going to get what we deserve, including through House subpoenas if it takes that. The third category that I focused on in my discussions with Gina McCarthy and the EPA are underlying research data. EPA has done a lot of really important rulemaking in the last several years. And in each of those cases, they base that rulemaking on specific research. One big problem is the world, the public, even including members of Congress, have not had availability of that research data so that we can simply sort of compare notes and enlist outside experts to say, look, does this data really lead to that rule? Does it really lead to that conclusion? Well, this has been an ongoing argument for a long time. And finally, in the midst of these discussions related to the Gina McCarthy nomination, we've scored a breakthrough. EPA has absolutely categorically committed to obtain the requested scientific information, that data from the researchers, from the institutions that did the research. They will absolutely request that and follow up on that. Secondly, EPA has already reached out to relevant institutions for information on how to de-identify and code personally identifying information that may be in the data. None of us want personally identifying information. None of us want versions of the data that make it clear who individuals who are involved in the studies. We don't care about that. We want the overall data. And so EPA is already talking to the institutions about how to scrub the data so that they don't give us what we were never interested in, personally identifying information. And third, for the first time, we should be able to determine if there is any way of independently reanalyzing the science and benefit claims for these major regulations, which are mostly the major air regulations that the nominee, Gina McCarthy, led the way on. So this really is a breakthrough because it's a path forward to get the underlying data so we can independently examine, have experts look at the data and ask, does it really lead to this regulation? Does it really justify this regulation? The fourth category that I focused on in terms of my discussions with the EPA over the Gina McCarthy nomination is economic analysis. By law, EPA, like other federal agencies, are supposed to do a cost-benefit analysis before they do a big rulemaking. So part of their rulemaking is supposed to be a cost-benefit analysis to see if the rule is justified. In my opinion, that cost-benefit analysis is done in such a way to be laughable in some cases, to be ludicrous. It is designed to reach a particular result, not designed to be an objective cost-benefit analysis. So we wanted EPA to go back to the drawing board, do an open-ended cost-benefit analysis, not designed to reach a particular conclusion, but just designed to truly, objectively compare costs and benefits. As a result of our discussions, EPA has committed to convene an independent panel of economic experts with experience in whole economy modeling at the macro and micro level. And they're going to review EPA's modeling and the agency's ability to measure full regulatory impacts. Now, that's sort of a bunch of gobbledygook, particularly this whole economy modeling. But that is where we need to do true cost-benefit analysis to look at all of the macro impacts, all of the impacts of a rule on the whole economy, not very narrowly define the analysis in order to get to a certain conclusion. A good example is we need, when they're doing rulemaking, to understand the impact on energy prices throughout the entire economy. That is often a huge impact of their rulemaking, particularly, say, in their recent air rulemaking, the so-called war on coal. We need to see how many jobs that really costs us in the whole economy. Otherwise, this idea of cost-benefit is not meaningful. And so they have committed to convene this independent panel. This panel will be tasked with making recommendations to the agency so that the EPA does it right, so that it is a significant, objective, meaningful cost-benefit analysis, not just an exercise they have to go through and that they design to reach a certain result. And the fifth and final category on which I focused in terms of my discussions with the EPA over the Gina McCarthy nomination was so-called sue and settle. Sue and settle is a tool that environmentalists and their allies at EPA have used with increasing frequency in the last several years, the last 5 years in particular. When the environmental left wants to reach an objective, what they often do is sue the EPA under environmental legislation and environmental statute. And so they're the plaintiff, and the Obama EPA are the defendants, and they have a lawsuit. And then after a few months, they agree to settle the lawsuit, and the judge signs off on it. Usually the judge is more than willing to do that because it gets a big and time-consuming and complicated case out of his hands, off his docket. Now, what's the matter with that? Well, what's the matter with that is essentially the environmental left and the EPA are on the same side of the issue. They usually agree on the fundamentals of the issue. The folks who are truly on the other side, who often include stakeholders, landowners, businesses, state and local government, they never have a seat at the table with regard to the settlement. So this is a behind closed doors negotiation, which is one-sided, which doesn't include anyone on the true other side of the issue, doesn't include landowners affected, doesn't include other stakeholders, doesn't include state and local government, which are often directly affected, which often have their role in some of these matters taken away. And so we need to make that sue and settle process more fair, and we need to take the abuse out of it. And because we discussed this with EPA, we got the following important concessions. First, it helps resolve some of the challenges with lack of public input in closed-door settlement agreements, otherwise referred to as sue and settle. EPA will publish on 2 websites the notices of intent to sue and petitions for rulemaking upon receipt. So at least the world out there will know what's going on at the front end. At least the stakeholders, the landowners, state and local government, other affected parties will know what's going on. Secondly, the web address for the petitions for rulemaking are that, and the web address for the notices of intent to sue is that. That is very, very important notice with regard to potential sue and settle agreements so that affected parties can begin to have input. They can't possibly have input if they don't even know that there's a discussion going on, and they don't find that out until the final result is announced. So, Mr. President, those are the results of our discussions with EPA. As I said at the beginning, I don't agree with Barack Obama or Gina McCarthy's positions on most of the big issues at EPA, including the war on coal. I don't agree with their actions that are costing millions of jobs around the country, that are increasing significantly the price of American energy. But I'm not going to be able to fix that given the last election. President Obama was reelected. What we attempted to do is talk to EPA about things that we should be able to agree on, things that should be beyond dispute, beyond ideology, beyond argument. And that is giving the American people, including their representatives in Congress, full and adequate information about what's going on, having people get the information they deserve, having that give and take, which is supposed to be there and assured, cleaning up abuses in FOIA, cleaning up abuses in private and hidden and fake email accounts. Those are abuses that have gone on at EPA for a long time and have been particularly problematic in the last 5 years. Those are the sort of things we're going to fix through these agreements. And I think that will get us down the road to having a real discussion about the true facts behind proposed EPA regulations, the true science, the true costs and benefit, and not allowing EPA to do so much that is so important behind closed doors without that full and open discussion of the true facts. I think this is an important step forward. That's why I agreed, as I promised to at the beginning of the process, to vote for cloture on the Gina McCarthy nomination if we made this important progress. I set that metric. I made that commitment at the beginning of the process. I didn't think we'd get nearly as far as we did in terms of commitments out of EPA. But since we did, since we made all of that substantive process, I'm certainly going to honor that commitment with regard to the cloture vote. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.